If you're
Right.
telling someone to not have corn when that's a huge part of their diet, but also their cultural identity, I think that's doing way more harm than, restricting their oral intake from a nutrition perspective, but also their mental health, right?
Right. Hey everyone, welcome to Food Culture Curious. I am your host, Arely Gutierrez. As a first-gen Mexican American, and especially now working in healthcare as a dietitian, I have seen firsthand how a lack of cultural inclusion can really negatively impact our patients. And I want to help change that. So I started Food Culture Curious to have impactful conversations with healthcare professionals of different cultures and backgrounds to get their insight on how to be more culturally inclusive in our nutrition recommendations. It can make all the difference in the world to our patients. Let's continue this journey together with today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome to Food Culture Curious. My name is Arely. Today with us we have Yimin Teo, MSRD, CNSC. She is a Los Angeles-based registered dietitian nutritionist and certified nutrition support clinician. She is originally from Singapore and she owns Yimin Teo Nutrition, a virtual nutrition private practice specializing in inflammatory bowel disease and GI conditions that aims to empower individuals of diverse cultural backgrounds to achieve peace and freedom from gut symptoms while rebuilding their relationships with food and culture. Welcome, Yumin.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, we connected on Instagram. It feels like forever ago,
Yeah.
but it finally lined up that we could have this conversation.
Yeah.
And so, talk to us a little bit about your cultural identity, the major foods that you grew up with, anything you'd like to share with us about your memories.
Yeah. So I am originally from Singapore, born and raised there, and I came over to the US for college. So I've also been in the US for a little bit. So it's been kind of interesting, an interesting journey to experience like food cultures on both sides and also the spectrum of everything in the middle. And I feel like for a lot of, immigrants or for individuals who have went on to a different country or culture, they probably have experienced some degree of that as well. And so I mainly grew up around, a large variety of different foods. So in Singapore, there's actually a lot of different cultures, and we call it like a melting pot because there's traditionally it is a trading hub in Southeast Asia. So a lot of the countries traders will come to Singapore. It is also a financial hub. So as some of the traders and even my ancestors from Fujian, China, different multiple generations ago, they came over, settled down, and along that journey, they have brought the food cultures, cultural practices, beliefs, heritage over, and that's similar to a lot of other cultures too. So, just kind of a quick summary of Singapore. It is a very small city state island, if you would. It's actually only as big as New York City. So, very
Oh, wow.
small, densely packed. So, if you kind of think about like Hong Kong and New York and kind of like the hecticness or how cram and dense it is. It's very much that, but with so many different like cultural groups and foods available. And so very often you'll see foods from different cultures, like from Malay culture, Indian cultures, or even now I feel like there's been so many immigrants that have come in and there's a lot of different like Asian fusion dishes too. You got your traditional hawker centers, which is just like little stalls in like different neighborhoods, selling very traditional food, simple dishes that we eat on a day-to-day basis, all the way up to like Michelin star restaurants. And so, growing up around such a diversity of foods is really cool because number one, I got to be exposed. And so I felt like I was a lot more adventurous, trying different things, different foods, drinks, desserts, and it helps me to be more inclusive. Also, I think when it comes to interacting with different people from different cultures and backgrounds, because I've grown up in that environment, it's a lot easier to kind of stay curious and be interested in other people's culture and their backgrounds too.
Yeah, when you compare it to New York City, I can kind of get what you're saying. Like it's such a melting pot and it's so hectic in a good way. So in your household growing up, what were your typical foods, like specifically protein, starches, produce?
Yeah, so I grew up with my grandmother's cooking, and so she's a very, very good cook. And I think this is probably very similar to a lot of families there too. And she would traditionally make a lot of Chinese food from scratch and a lot of curries, a lot of very aromatic dishes. And typically, I would call it like Singaporean Chinese dish, but the way that our dishes have evolved over time, especially with a lot of the cultural influences and backgrounds. I mean, curry is not really traditionally like a Chinese dish, but a lot of the influences and herbs and spices that came from our Malay friends, Malay group, Indian food, yeah, Indian cuisine as well. So there's a lot of kind of blend in that sense. A lot of curry leaves, lemongrass, turmeric, along a lot of flavor. And so very often I grew up having just, we'll call it like community meals. And so in Mandarin, we call it san cai yi tang. So it's like three veggie or three dishes and one soup. So there's always a soup there. And there's always a protein or at least two protein dishes. So it could be like, she would usually make like just a plain deep fried fish that's really fresh. And you really don't need much seasoning with it. And it's so delicious. Deep fried tofu, stewed eggplant, watercress, water spinach. So very traditional, like green leafy veggies too. That now that as a dietitian, I think back about it, it's actually very balanced.
Yeah.
You don't really think about it in the macronutrient sense, like how we were taught in school. But
Mhm.
back then, the consideration is like, what is the cheapest, ingredients on sale? And what's the freshest for that season or that window of time? Because in Singapore, a lot of food is imported. About 90, more than
Mhm.
90% of our food is imported because we don't really have space to grow them. And
Yeah.
so very often my grandma would say, oh, I've bought this specific fish because that is in season in China or somewhere else. And so there's always that blend of, seafood is very often on the table, meatballs or meat wraps, braised pork belly. That's like a traditional go-to with a lot of different spices, like five spice, anise, cinnamon, things like that. And obviously rice. So rice is life. It is the center
Yeah.
of, all dishes, fried rice or white rice. We don't really eat brown rice in our family, but it's just like the perfect canvas when you're having so many different flavors from different dishes. And
Mhm.
so food has always been very fun and enjoyable. It's almost like a journey with each meal because besides experimenting with different food combos, with my grandma's specialty chili sauce that she makes from scratch, so delicious. But also the conversations we all have at the table, checking in on each other. How's your day? How's everything going? It's just like a very nice, comforting setup, or I guess like, time of the day that we can all come back to. Yeah. So that's definitely one of the core memories of me growing up back home.
Awesome. And so, do you feel these memories of, growing up and your grandmother's cooking, did that inspire you to be involved in cooking and nutrition?
So on the cooking aspect for sure, I think like I'm always in the kitchen with her just because I mean I'm a nosy person. I want to see what she's up to. And as she's like prepping different vegetables or meats, I would ask her like how it's done or just like watch her really. As a kid, she doesn't really want me to, disturb her workflow. So she would just say like just sit on the chair. But I think like just seeing how comfortable she is in the kitchen and all the delicious food that she makes, it makes me want to recreate that too. My mom doesn't really cook that much, not that often because she's always busy. And so I think as I grow older, my thing was also that the thought that I have was that I want to really preserve these recipes that I can share with my community in the future, right? Grandma's never gonna be around forever. Yes, but not, she can't cook for me 24/7. So that really kind of was my goal. Like every time now when I visit Singapore, I always chat with her and try to get the recipes from her. I feel like that generation of people just don't keep written recipes.
Yeah.
So she's just like, oh, just add a little bit of, this and that and just cook it for like a couple minutes. And I'm like, that's like not, it's not very specific or helpful. But I think, looking back, it probably kind of inspired like my journey as a dietitian because I've always liked food and the conversation I had with my mom, like when I first came to the US, was like, well, I don't really know what major I need to choose. I have to choose a major. And she's like, well, you like food, you like baking, just go into nutrition. And then just kind of how it all started. And so now, knowing the science behind food and growing up with utilizing food, as a healing modality or as medicine or in the significance of food in the cultural sense, I think it's kind of all coming back to full
Yeah.
circle. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting where there are some moments where we look at, those family meals, you see like the protein, carbs, and fiber. I'm like, oh yeah, like that's totally makes sense with what I've studied in nutrition and dietetics. So it's very really valuable in that sense. It's like our ancestors kind of knew what they were doing, it just kind of got passed down that way. So
Yeah, exactly. I was talking about this with another dietitian, how no matter what culture, we tend to have that blend of proteins, fats, starches, like everything was already passed down because that's how we survived. That's how we nourished ourselves over the centuries. And so tell me a little bit more as far as your traditional dishes, specifically about your holidays. What are some major popular dishes that you see during different holidays?
yeah, so for my family specifically, Chinese New Year is definitely the biggest one. We have a couple days, kind of like Thanksgiving in the US, where you got Thanksgiving and Black Friday. For Chinese New Year in Singapore, at least, we have 2 to 3 days of vacation. In China, they have 2 weeks. That's what I've heard from my friends. And so it's a very symbolic time of the year where we celebrate new beginnings, where families reunite and come together. And then obviously having those wishes and goals that we have for the new year that we can bless each other, within the community. And so in my family, very often we prep a lot of dishes from scratch. We're kind of like the central family where a lot of our relatives and extended family will come visit. And so
Mhm.
my grandma is like the chef, right? Like she would make a lot of the traditional dishes like pig stomach soup. I don't know if that's something also in like other cultures, but that's something that she makes and everybody really, really loves it. There's also kind of like egg rolls where, we shred a lot of the veggies and tofu, which is really the protein. It's a naturally vegetarian dish, which is great,
Mhm.
wrapped in like a rice paper. It's a little different from the Vietnamese rice sheet. This one's a little bit
Mm.
more pliable and softer or it's steamed and it's not dried. And
Oh,
so
okay.
we have other stuff like chicken curry, vermicelli noodles. So we will be prepping for like a good week or two. We're coming up with like the grocery list, like what to buy. And I think that kind of resonates with a lot of, families who
Hmm.
cooks or prepares food like during the holiday season. There's so much planning and obviously some associated stress along with that. But those really form like the core memories that we always kind of reminisce on, right? And so, the prep, like going to the market and buying all the ingredients, making sure that we're not buying it too early or too late so that things don't, spoil. And then really getting the family together to cook. And so the prep usually takes the longest, kind of like, cutting the vegetables, stir frying some of the chili and ingredients. And so during those times is kind of where we reconnect, kind of just have the small talk. And I think that's always really nice to reconnect with family. And another dish that's really symbolic, at least in like Malaysia, Indonesia, probably, and also Singapore, it's a fish, like a fish salad. It's called yu sheng. So it's actually a huge plate of salad, different ingredients like shredded vegetables, salmon, which kind of is symbolic for prosperity and wealth. Chinese New Year is all about wealth, all about may you be rich. We want you to be wealthy, in terms of happiness, money, and all that kind of stuff. And so it's a huge salad, which will kind of cover like the whole table. We'll have like sweet plum sauce, which also signifies like hoping for the next year to have a lot of like happiness and sweetness. And we'll all grab a pair of chopsticks around the table, usually a round table, and we'll all start tossing the salad. Well,
Really?
that term kind of sometimes means something else, but yeah, that's kind of like the cultural significance where like we're tossing the veggies as high as we can because that gives us the blessing of like, oh, there's more and more wealth the higher that we toss, the veggies. And
How
so
fun.
yeah, it's really fun. It's very messy, but there's always so much laughter and happiness with that. Yeah, and it's great. And so that's a cultural part that we typically try to keep. Even in the US with our friends, we'll try to like introduce that to our friends from different cultures because it's very specific to Southeast Asia. And so
Yeah.
it's always really nice and fun to have that culture exchange. So
Yeah, I would totally do that.
yeah. When you come to LA during Chinese New Year, we can totally have this yusheng party.
Yeah, that's funny. In our culture, we throw lentils during New Year for luck. And so speaking of, cultural health beliefs and food, is there any specific foods in your culture that represent health, especially, if someone's not feeling well, you're sick, these are your go-to foods?
Yeah, very commonly, I mean, kind of leaning into a lot of traditional Chinese medicine principles. That's very common and very established in Singapore. And so, at least in the Chinese culture. So, the idea of using food as medicine or have food having some healing properties, those are typically incorporated routinely into like our meals. So, very often things like ginger, jujubes, goji berries, some of the things that have become superfoods in the nutrition world recently,
Mm.
they are traditionally incorporated into our diets. And so sometimes I kind of feel like, oh, that's our best kept secrets, and now it's like a superfood. And so the interesting thing is that there's no one traditional food that's considered like a superfood necessarily. In Chinese medicine, a lot of the concept around like using food as medicine is the synergistic effect of foods. And so not just adding ginger to target one specific property, but how can we incorporate other Chinese herbs or different spices, like warming spices? Ginger is a warming spice. So like star anise, cinnamon, how can we add those ingredients together that makes the food tasty, but also has healing properties because we're having it so frequently in our diet. So I think that's a perspective that I think I very much appreciate TCM because it is kind of like forcing us to zoom out of the picture a little bit and really looking at nutrition and food from a holistic perspective, right? So it's not just like, green leafy vegetables having a lot of folate. It's more like, oh, what are the other components or the properties of it? Is it heat? Is it like heaty or is it cooling? And how can we combine other food to really help promote health? And I think like in terms of the way we learn about nutrition dietetics, in our field, we talk a lot about we don't want to take food away from people, right? Like how can we
Hmm.
add more foods? And I think this is the concept that starts kind of overlapping. Like, okay, well now we're talking about synergistic effects of nutrition and food. What are other things that we can add so that we can help you to feel better, relieve symptoms and improve health? So I think that's definitely one of the perks of looking at nutrition from a different perspective, from a more traditional medicine perspective or Eastern medicine. So,
Awesome. And I hope I phrased this correctly. So when you talk about, warming versus cooling, do you try to balance that in each meal, or is it if you have like this affliction, you address that with warming or you address that with cooling? Like, how can you talk a little bit about how that works?
yeah, so at least with on the food aspect of things, the warming and cooling properties in a specific meal does matter, but
Mhm.
it also kind of focuses on the accumulative effects. So, maybe depend on each person's body type is different. So some individuals might have more heaty body type or like cooler body type. And so, when we say, okay, both of you like go eat some ginger, for example, very simplistic example. The person who has a more heaty body type, they might show more signs of heatiness. So it could be like constipation, sore throat, things like that. But for the person with the more cool body type, it kind of neutralizes that, right? So maybe they have more signs of like cold hands and feet, you know, they feel cold easily, and the ginger can help warm them up in that sense.
Mm.
And so everybody's body type is so different, and depending on like the amounts of the food or like what day, what part of the day or what part of the season they're having different foods, it can, promote different effects. And so I think it can be used in two different situations, right? So like for example, very commonly, at least in northern China, it's when it's during winter time. Very often you will see lamb or lamb soup in their culture because it's very warming. The weather is really cold outside, they have to keep their body warm, and that's usually like a really good, traditional source of ingredient food in their culture in that specific region of the country. But if you would do that in Singapore, where it's like so hot and tropical all the time, you start if you're having a lot of lamb soup, it's too heaty for the body. And so I think that's the concept that Western medicine don't really focus on. And I think there's value in kind of like incorporating both. Or with some individuals, they really value using Eastern medicine or Ayurvedic medicine. And I think there is room for both Eastern and
Yeah.
Western. It's just at this point, it's finding the right practitioner to kind of help bridge that two sides of things and still get you to the place of, better health and well-being.
Absolutely. I can see how if you find the right practitioner, they can marry that together, right? That can be very important, especially if someone that has a mixed cultural background or they want to try more than one thing. I'm sure that that's something that you do in your practice. Can you talk a little bit about specifically what you do and how you incorporate that type of medicine into your nutrition practice?
Yeah, so in my virtual private practice, I specialize in inflammatory bowel disease, so Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, and alongside with other GI conditions as well. And really, the perspective and approach that I offer is focusing on culturally inclusive nutrition therapy. And so not necessarily deep diving into traditional Chinese medicine, it's just more of offering the different perspective and space for patients of different cultural backgrounds, to really bring forth like what is important to them in their culture, beliefs, values that is very often associated with food and nutrition, and even body image, right? And I think sometimes that those kinds of intimate conversations need time and space to be unpacked and talked about because very often there's so many confusing messaging in the gut health space, especially with social media. I mean, with us practitioners as
Mhm.
dietitians, we see that all the time. And, some of the messaging can be unintentionally harmful, where where some practitioners or individuals are telling others to cut out certain food groups, certain food components, and you really don't know what that effect has on somebody on the other side of the screen, right? If you're
Right.
telling someone to not have corn when that's a huge part of their diet, but also their cultural identity, I think that's doing way more harm than, restricting their oral intake from a nutrition perspective, but also their mental health, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the part that, with my practice, my goal is to really help connect that relationship with food, culture, body image, beliefs, and values. And there's ways to improve GI symptoms or in setting of IBD, getting patients into remission, but still honoring those cultural foods and even cultural settings. Like interactions with your families, community, very often is centered around food. And so talking
Mhm.
about like strategies to navigate that, maybe in some situations, like some patients are not comfortable talking about, the disease or diet, then we come up with personalized strategies to kind of help support patients through that process. So I think there needs to be more of us, dietitians from
Mhm.
different cultural backgrounds. It's impossible for us to know everything about every culture, but I think the perspective that we have can really help support patients in a safer way.
Yes, absolutely. I would love to, well, I have you pick your brain as far as, unfortunately, there's such few of us. And sometimes I feel like one part of addressing um, or one part of being inclusive in nutrition is educating others in case they come across a patient of our population, right? If another dietitian of a different culture than yours wanted to counsel someone from your culture, do you have any practical tips as far as how they can include some of their cultural foods in working with IBD symptoms?
Yeah, I think very often, patients who have IBD or any GI conditions, when they're
Mhm.
experiencing symptoms or quote unquote flaring, obviously that's a very generic term and we can have a whole other conversation about that.
Yeah.
The first thing that people would naturally be inclined to is to start restricting in sessions on, what are some foods that you have excluded? Do you miss those foods? Do those foods have any significance for you? And just kind of let patients take the wheel, have kickstart those conversations, because we don't know what we don't know, and we can ask prompts to kind of help tease that out from people that we're working with. And I think ultimately our job is to identify if patients are like blanketly excluding, whole food groups, and kind of help navigating that. Like, do we really have to do that, or is it specific food triggers that are causing issues for you? Talking about how to nourish our body in a culturally inclusive way and what that could look like. It's just, I think, having more curiosity and allowing patients to share their story. And very often, like, that can give you so much information on, what are some little tweaks or areas that we can just focus on, like in this one session. Like, we are not here to overhaul your diet. Is there some little adjustments that we can do to help you better nourish yourself without needing to exclude things completely? And so I think assuming things less just because someone's from a specific culture, because
Mhm.
even though I'm from Singapore, maybe, I don't have a traditional diet, or maybe I'm having a completely like American or westernized diet. Like, we don't really know that until we kind of start exploring that conversation. Like, oh, what do you usually eat? If someone's living with a family, how's the diet situation like at home? Who's preparing the food? And do you have any control or say over what you're eating or what you're drinking, right? And I think, like, with families and communities, there's a lot of dynamics there that should be
Mhm.
explored before we start kind of recommending implementing nutrition changes. That's one thing that I've noticed among my patients, is that very often because it's such a communal approach, it's not individualistic in our cultures, right? And so how can we involve family or not outside the patient and their communities to really help support their nutrition care? It's kind of it takes a village. It's not just one person. And as dietitians, we can help to guide them in a safe manner while kind of helping them achieve their goals too. So less assumptions, more curiosity and questions. And I think letting the patients know that they can have control and they're empowered to also make their own decisions as well. Then again, it's a fine line to kind of navigate, but that's what we're here for.
Yeah, to capture all those nuances. But I hear what you're saying as far as addressing the food fear, which I feel is very common when there's, GI symptoms. Even with my patients on dialysis, they get so much fear because just by being on dialysis, that'll cause them to have GI issues,
Mhm.
from the
Yeah.
process itself or the medications they have to take or the diet that they have to be on. So I do hear those fears come through. So addressing those with them because they've probably been excluding foods, taking into account that, depending on the individual or could be based on culture, maybe not, but your family could be very much involved in your diet. So it sounds like addressing that as well is very important. And like you said, never making assumptions, no matter what culture the patient is from, to always be curious and always be asking. And that's something that I try to when I talk about being culturally inclusive, I always remind people about both sides of things, right? Like you want to be culturally competent in a way that, okay, like it's good to know, like if I speak to a patient, I want to know at least, what the dish is more or less to learn more about different cultures so I don't have to waste so much time Googling, like when we're talking to be familiar to a point, but never assuming because everyone, even if you have a 100 different patients from the exact same culture, they're all going to eat different. And there's
100%.
going to be regional differences and family differences and preferences. So just taking everything we learn with a grain of salt and understanding we're never going to know everything. It's a
Yeah,
really
I think
wonderful point.
Yeah, I think ultimately patients want to be heard. And I think, like,
Hmm.
being able to give them the time and space to share their perspective, and it's also a space for reflection, right? And I think, speaking of all of that, I think stress definitely can also manifest symptoms.
Hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
it's not just stress about food, but also stress from other areas of life, right? It could be, depending on the family dynamics, or like right now a lot of civil unrest that's happening across the world, I think we're
Right.
definitely undermining how much that impacts someone's GI symptoms, at least for the clients that I work with. So I think it becomes almost like a therapeutic session, if you would.
Yeah.
But I think that's also the value that we can bring to the table to kind of help our patients in that sense. So
There's so much that goes into it. And like you said, we could have a whole other conversation about that. So I hate to wrap up. It feels like the time just flew by, but I'd love to have people find you if they want to work with you. How can they find you?
yeah, so I am on Instagram. My handle is herbs and food. Very, reflective of like what I enjoy and what I like to do. And also my website, you can find me at emonteonutrition.com.
Perfect. And thank you again so much for being on.
Thank you so much, Aurelie, for having me.
All right. Thank y'all, everyone. Until next time. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/foodculturecurious. Or as always, you can support by sharing, following, or rating this podcast. Every click from y'all means the world to me. And now for a quick disclaimer. Food Culture Curious is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not take the place of medical advice from licensed healthcare professionals. If you need to seek medical advice, please speak to your healthcare provider. Thank you for listening.